Welcome back, everybody. We're diving deep this week into the Chad Daybell trial. It's a case that's really captured a lot of attention, I think, with this whole blend of, religious mystery and these really, really chilling accusations.
hmm
Week 3 brought us a whole bunch of new witnesses and, honestly, some pretty out there defense tactics.
Absolutely. And this week, I think what was really fascinating was we got pulled deeper into the human side of the case, through these emotional testimonies, especially from people who knew Tammy Daybell personally.
Yeah.
That I think was just really impactful.
It's hard not to just feel for Kirby Ryan, Tammy's son. We
Mhm.
heard him on the stand this week, and he could barely even say his sister Tylee's name.
Right.
Like, wow, it's a tough reminder that behind all of the legal stuff and the arguments that, this is about real people and their families just completely shattered.
Absolutely. And what's crazy is that contrast that you see with Chad Daybell's behavior. Do you remember when that 911 call was played in court? The one he made right after Tammy died? Like he was just sobbing uncontrollably, but then later on when they were going through photos from the death scene, he seemed completely emotionless.
Yeah, it's just such a jarring contrast. Like, was he really that upset or was that for the jury? And when we talk about, inconsistencies, there was just so much testimony about Tammy's health before her death. Like Chad was saying that she was sick and had been throwing up even, but then we hear from the coroner that she actually had food in her stomach.
Right. I mean, these contradictions could be where the prosecution actually really gains some ground because it really points to this potential pattern of deception
Yeah.
in Chad's story. And then on top of that, you've got this whole missing Fitbit mystery.
Yeah, the Fitbit.
Right.
Mhm.
Witnesses that we heard from who knew Tammy, they all talked about her being this fitness enthusiast who could keep up with intense workouts no problem. So you'd think that her Fitbit data would tell a very different story than what Chad is describing.
Right, but instead of addressing that head on the defense, went in this really strange direction. John Pryor, who's Chad's attorney, tried to imply that maybe Tammy was cheating on her Fitbit, like during a family step count competition.
Oh, wow.
He even went so far as to suggest that she wasn't as fit as these witnesses were describing her.
Really? Wow. That could backfire because trying to discredit Tammy's lifestyle and physique might come across as really insensitive when the focus should be on how she died,
Yeah, for sure. It just made me wonder what the jury thought about all that.
Mm.
And then we get into this whole light and darkness thing, which is just bizarre. The defense is saying that based on some text messages they presented, that Tammy was a part of this whole system where Chad was judging people's spiritual standing.
This is where the case gets really complex because you're dealing with religious beliefs. And it's important to remember that, interpretations of faith vary widely, even within the same community. So John Pryor is arguing that Tammy was fully on board with Chad's, you know, unconventional views. But it's also possible that she was just more familiar with general concepts of light and darkness. A lot of people in the LDS community are. It's just a nuanced situation for sure.
Yeah, for sure. We can't lose sight of those nuances. And we also can't ignore the other people involved in all this. The trial brought in Detective Doug Hart, who read aloud those, pretty personal text messages between Chad and Lori Vallow. Remember, she's his alleged mistress and now wife.
Right. And she's facing her own trial for the deaths of her kids.
Yeah, a case that's completely connected to all of this.
For sure. And Chad seemed really strangely proud when they were reading those messages aloud. I mean, it suggests he doesn't have any remorse or even understand how serious this all is.
Definitely a weird moment. And then you've got the testimony of David Warwick. He's Melanie Gibbs' husband.
Right. Melanie Gibb was really close with Lori at one point.
Yeah. What did you think about his testimony?
Well, he said that he never thought that Chad was a prophet, which I found interesting. Because Chad himself was saying that he was, a prophet. So it shows that not everyone believed Chad's claims of spiritual authority, even the people close to him.
And remember all that stuff about JJ being labeled a zombie? David even talked about wanting to inspect JJ to see if it was true.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that just shows that even within Chad's inner circle, there was some skepticism about his more extreme beliefs. But even with all of that, the prosecution's been getting some criticism for how they're handling this. Some people think they aren't passionate enough, especially when it comes to their objections, and they're letting John Pryor control how the story's being told.
That's a fair point.
Yeah.
Will being passive stop them from getting a conviction? It's a good question. But before we move on, there's one more witness whose testimony I just couldn't get out of my head. The coroner, Brenda Dye, she admitted that she didn't request an autopsy for Tammy because of budget issues.
Wow, that is wild. It just makes you think about the limitations of small-town justice systems sometimes. Like, they just don't have the resources they need.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder how many cases might get missed because of that.
For sure. Yeah, it really highlights that justice, isn't always a sure thing. But even with all that, there were some really human moments that stood out, like the testimony from Tammy's fitness instructor.
Yeah.
It just painted such a vivid picture of her,
Well,
like
yeah.
she was describing Tammy as this woman who just loved to dance and full of life, and she could easily keep up with these really intense workouts.
Yeah, it's a totally different picture than what the defense is trying to show.
Right.
We also heard from some of Tammy's classmates, and they all said the same thing. Like, Tammy was in great shape, and there was no sign that she was ill or anything.
Yeah, those firsthand accounts are huge, right? Because it really challenges the defense's whole idea that Tammy was unhealthy or unfit. They're reminding us that she was a real person, with passions and a love for life.
Yeah, for sure. And that makes it even weirder when the defense decided to body shame Tammy.
Oh, yeah. John Pryor's questions about Tammy's weight and all those attempts to say that she wasn't fit just felt so irrelevant and honestly disrespectful.
Yeah, it's such a common tactic, though.
Yeah,
It's like they're trying to distract from the evidence and make it about how the victim looked.
exactly.
Like they're saying, well, maybe she died because she was out of shape, which is just ridiculous.
Right.
So you've got this back and forth between the prosecution and the defense,
Hmm.
all these personal stories about Tammy, and so many questions that are still unanswered.
And we can't forget about Lori Vallow,
Mhm.
Chad's alleged mistress and now wife,
Right.
who's facing her own trial for killing her kids. I mean, these two cases are so connected, it's crazy.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that this whole thing is way bigger than just Tammy's death. It's a bunch of lives all tangled up together, and trying to find justice is complicated.
Speaking of justice, the defense brought up something else that was really interesting. Raccoons. Apparently, the Daybells had a raccoon problem back in 2019.
Wait, what? Raccoons. What do raccoons have to do with a murder trial?
Well, it goes back to one of the most incriminating things against Chad, the raccoon text. On the day that they think Tylee was buried on Chad's property, he sent a text to Tammy about shooting a raccoon.
Oh, so the prosecution thinks he was making up an alibi so that if anyone noticed him doing something weird on his property that day, he could just say he was dealing with raccoons.
Exactly. And by bringing up this whole raccoon problem, the defense is trying to make it seem like talking about raccoons. Isn't that strange?
That's pretty smart,
Right.
but I wonder if it'll actually work on the jury.
Yeah.
And it kind of goes back to those concerns about how the prosecution is doing this whole thing.
Yeah.
Like, they don't seem to object that strongly to some of John Pryor's tactics, like this raccoon thing. Some people are worried about that.
Right. They've been called passive. And it does make you wonder if they're doing enough to push back against the defense's version of events. Like, are they letting John Pryor take over?
Maybe they've got a plan that we don't know about. Maybe they're just trying to build a really strong case based on facts instead of getting lost in all the legal stuff.
Yeah, that's possible. But it's definitely a risky move, and things got even more intense when they revealed that Tammy had 2 life insurance policies worth a total of $430,000.
Oh, that's a lot of money. Does that mean Chad had a financial motive?
It definitely adds another piece to the puzzle. I mean, motive by itself isn't enough to say someone's guilty, but when you add it to Chad's weird behavior and all the things that don't add up in his story, it starts to look pretty bad for him.
Yeah, true. And to make things even weirder, the defense brought in a witness who said that Chad was this humble, meek, and mild kind of guy.
Really? Trying to paint him as this innocent guy just doesn't match up with all the stuff that suggests he was actually manipulating and controlling people.
Right. It was almost funny watching him just nodding along while the witness was talking.
It shows you how much he wants to control the story, like how he wants people to see him. But will that work when there's so much evidence against him?
That's the big question, right?
Right.
Even if they're trying to make him look good, they can't just ignore all the text messages, the witness testimonies, and all the holes in his story.
Yeah, it's a lot to explain away.
But at the end of the day, the jury is the one that decides. They've seen all the evidence and heard everyone's stories and watched how Chad acts.
It's all going to come down to what they believe. Will they think Chad is telling the truth, or will they see through it and find him guilty?
It's going to be intense, that's for sure. But while we're waiting for the verdict, we should remember how much this has affected the people involved. Like Tammy's Aunt Vicky, she's been in the courtroom every single day. It's like a silent reminder of how much the family is hurting and how badly they want justice.
Yeah, her being there just shows you that this isn't just about the law. It's about real people whose lives have been destroyed by this.
And we can't forget about Tammy's kids either. They've lost their mom, and now they have to deal with everyone talking about this case and the media attention. It's got to be so hard for them.
Yeah, It's a reminder that these things have consequences that go way beyond the courtroom.
This whole deep dive has taken us on a roller coaster of emotions, shocking discoveries, and legal strategies. We're at the halfway point of the trial, and it's so tense.
As we get closer to the end of the trial, the big question is, will justice be served for Tammy Daybell? It's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next few weeks. Both sides are going to be making their final arguments, and the jury has to decide what they believe. But while that's all happening, I think it's good to think about what this case means in a bigger sense.
What stands out to you about that?
Well, this trial really brings up some important stuff about the dangers of religious extremism and how crucial it is to think critically, especially when you've got these really charismatic people making these big claims.
It shows you that just blindly believing something can have really terrible consequences.
Yeah, and it also makes you think about how important it is to be smart about the media you consume these days. We've seen how people can twist information and tell stories that aren't true. It's up to us to figure out what's real and what's not.
Yeah, we can't just take everything we hear or read as fact. We have to actually think about it and question things and try to get different perspectives.
Yeah.
So what do you think our listeners should take away from this whole deep dive into the Chad Daybell trial?
I think the biggest thing is to be skeptical and think critically. Don't just believe something because someone tells you to, especially when it comes to big ideas and beliefs. Ask questions, do your own research, and be careful of people who act like they have all the answers.
That's good advice for life in general.
Totally. And this case also shows us that finding justice can be a really long and difficult process. It takes time and patience and dedication to finding the truth, even when it's hard to face.
And even when the trial is over, the people closest to the victims are still going to be dealing with the effects of what happened. We saw that with Tammy's Aunt Vicky being in court every day.
Right.
And how much pain Colby, her son, was in.
Their stories show us that this isn't just some legal battle or courtroom drama. This is about real people whose lives have been changed forever by loss and betrayal. This deep dive has taken us through so many emotions and shocking discoveries, and we've learned a lot about how the legal system works. It's been a really complex and heartbreaking story. As the trial wraps up, we'll be watching to see what the prosecution does with their final arguments, how the defense tries to fight back against all the evidence, and of course, what the jury ultimately decides. We want to know what you think. What parts of this case really stuck with you? Do you think the prosecution has a strong case? Let us know your thoughts and join the conversation online. And if you want to stay updated on this trial, make sure you subscribe to The Deep Dive. We'll keep bringing you in-depth analysis and insights into this fascinating case. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep searching for the truth.